A nightmare is unfolding around the world. We learn now that China is warning that North Korea has assembled a tremendous arsenal of nuclear weapons. The number I'd heard a few years ago was 6. Now they say it's 20, and they could increase very rapidly. On top of that, the Iranians sending warships down off the coast of the Gulf of Aden. And who knows what confrontation might come about. They're fast building a nuclear device, and then they also have the capability of sending them long range. What is going to happen to our world if crazy people, fanatical regimes, have their hands on this weapons of terror and are able to bring them to bear on their neighbors or even as far away as Europe or the United States? Wendy?
That's a great question. Well, China says the North Koreans could soon build even more nuclear weapons, threatening America and most of Europe. George Thomas brings us the story.
The North Koreans may have as many as 20 nuclear warheads, and that number could climb to 50 or 100 in the next 5 years. According to the Wall Street Journal, Chinese nuclear experts are also warning that North Korea's ability to produce weapons-grade uranium could double by next year. And this assessment comes as a top U.S. official believes North Korea can now launch a missile with a nuclear warhead that could reach much of the western United States. Admiral William Gortney, head of U.S. Northern Command, says our assessment is that they have the ability to put a nuclear weapon on a KN-08 and shoot it at the homeland. We assess that it's operational today, and so we practice to go against it. North Korea's expanding arsenal has Japan and South Korea particularly concerned. This week, the U.S. signed a new nuclear energy agreement, allowing South Korea to conduct nuclear research, but not to produce its own nuclear fuel.
It is an agreement befitting of the deep partnership and strong alliance that exists between our two countries.
A top North Korean shot back at the agreement, calling America's foreign policy hostile to the region.
The anachronistic, hostile policy of the U.S. on the DPRK and its reckless confrontation mania prolonged the touch-and-go situation in the Korean Peninsula.
The revelation of the North's accelerated nuclear program has some Republican lawmakers worried about President Obama's deal with Iran that is supposed to limit its nuclear program. A 1996 agreement with North Korea was supposed to stop Pyongyang's nuclear capabilities. It didn't. Instead, now the North is building a set of nuclear weapons. The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, told the Journal he fears the same could happen with Iran. We saw how North Korea was able to game this whole process. I wouldn't be surprised if Iran had its hands on the same playbook. George Thomas, CBN News.
So what do we do? Do we take preemptive steps to knock out that nuclear capability before it gets operational? Or do we just sit back and then shake in our boots? Do you realize what a crazy dictator can do? He can say, we hold San Francisco or Los Angeles hostage. If you don't do what we want you to do, we will destroy 2 of your major cities because we can reach them and we have the capability. Are we going to allow that to happen? And then in the Middle East, we'll have Iran clearly having expressed their deep-held belief that Israel should be exterminated. Are we going to allow them to go ahead and do that? Will Israel go ahead and allow them to do that? I mean, we've got to be faced with these things. And ladies and gentlemen, it takes a lot of prayer, but are we going to just sit idly by and allow these crazy regimes? North Korea is like a criminal enterprise. It's a crime family in charge of a nation. And over in Iran, it's Islamic fanatics in charge of a nation. And they have the resources to do terrible, terrible things. Look at North Korea. They shut Sony down. They didn't like a movie that Sony was put out. They literally shut the thing down with cyber attacks. North Korea did that to Sony, to an American corporation. What could they do with nuclear weapons? Well, in other news, our CBN News terrorism analyst, Eric Stakelbeck, warned about the dangers of terrorism recruiting in the state of Minnesota. And now that warning is proving to be prophetic. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. Here's John.
Thanks, Pat. 4 young Minnesota men are in federal court today accused of conspiring to sneak into Syria to join ISIS. A total of 6 men between the ages of 19 and 21 were part of the plot. U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger says they had been planning for 10 months, even as co-conspirators were caught and charged.
Be clear, we have a terror recruiting problem in Minnesota. And this case demonstrates how difficult it is to put an end to recruiting here. These are focused men who are intent on joining a terrorist organization by any means possible.
2 of the suspects made it to California, where they were also facing charges. One of them posted jihadist images on Facebook and told an informant last year, "There's nothing for me in this world." Authorities say dozens of young Somali men have traveled from Minnesota to join terrorist groups in Somalia and Syria. Well, new details are emerging about the man French authorities say planned a terror attack near Paris, this one targeting Christians. Today, we're getting a look at the suspect, Sid Ahmed Glam, a 24-year-old Algerian computer science student. Authorities believe he was planning a massacre similar to the attacks at Charlie Hebdo magazine and a kosher supermarket.
This time it was Christians, French Catholics, who were targeted.
On Sunday, Glam tried to carry out his plan in a quiet Paris suburb where police believe he killed a woman who was sitting in her car. Shortly afterward, he accidentally shot himself in the foot and called an ambulance for help. French officials say Glam was on a watch list of people potentially traveling to Syria. Right now, investigators want to know if anyone may have been working with him. And last night, police arrested a person suspected to be acquainted with Glam, but police, Pat, haven't yet released any further details.
Ladies and gentlemen, does any of this get to you? I mean, you hear these things, and, you know, we sit at a desk and give you the news of what's happening around the world. Our reporters and our staff is tasked with finding out what's going on around the world. And there's some really frightening things. And the problem is we have a vacuum of leadership. So in Washington, you say, what's going to happen? Well, there's nobody who knows. And there's nobody who can tell us. I tell you, in my case, I find great comfort just at picking up the Bible and reading the Word of God and just realizing that God's in control of things. But this world is fast spinning out of control. And maybe that's what is going to happen before the Lord comes back. But it certainly is happening everywhere you turn. Radical Islam, communist ideology, extremism, and just madness seems to have seized a number of societies. And now we have the sophistication and the weapons to do something terrible to ourselves unless somebody stops it. John?
Pat, a surprise eruption from a volcano in Chile Wednesday. The Calbuco volcano erupted for the first time in more than 42 years, sending a huge cloud of ash over a sparsely populated mountain region a little more than 620 miles south of the capital of Santiago. The government issued a high alert, barring access around the area. The 6,500-foot volcano last erupted in 1972. It's considered one of the top 3 most potentially dangerous among Chile's 90 active volcanoes. Well, Israelis are celebrating their 67th national birthday, but the picnics and parties pale in comparison to the story that led to their independence. Chris Mitchell takes us to the heart of Tel Aviv, where it all began.
Here in Independence Hall on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the formation of the State of Israel. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people were a nation once again.
This is where Israel was born. When people come here, they are astonished to see this place. Most of the people that visit here, their first reaction is, this is it? That's all you have here?
Ben-Gurion and his team looked for an inconspicuous place to declare statehood. At the time, Independence Hall, one of the first buildings in Tel Aviv, was an art gallery. During a 1978 renovation, the decision was made to take the building back to its original look at the time of the declaration.
Traveling in Israel will teach you that God has a tendency to perform His best miracles in the most humble places. This place is one of those places.
According to Isaac Dror, who heads education at the hall, the establishment of Israel shook the world and became a haven for the Jewish people.
How many people prayed for it every day when the Jews said next year in Jerusalem and next year in Jerusalem? That's what they meant.
When Israel declared its independence, dancing filled the streets. But the celebration was short-lived. The very next day, armies of 5 Arab nations invaded the newborn state.
When it comes to the story of the War of Independence, we don't have many answers there. Very hard for us to explain. Call it a miracle, call it whatever you want, but we are here.
130,000 people visit this tiny hall each year to hear about the miracle of Israel, including tourists like this group from Massachusetts.
I didn't expect it to be so moving. My whole life, Israel has always been here. So I think in some ways took it for granted. And now I, felt like I was here that day.
After 2,000 years of wandering and persecution, for Jews to have their own state really has to be a miracle.
Across the street is this monument with a scripture from Jeremiah. Again I will build you, and you shall be rebuilt, O Virgin of Israel. Surrounded by skyscrapers and a new generation visiting the hall, it's testament to God's faithfulness to His promise to build and rebuild the Jewish state and its people. Chris Mitchell, CBN News at Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, Israel.
Here at home, can the government put the squeeze on farmers who grow raisins? That was the question before the Supreme Court Wednesday. Justices expressed their doubts federal officials can legally take raisins away from farmers without giving them a full payment. The program came from a 1937 law to keep prices steady by managing the amount of raisins on the market. But 2 California farmers say the program is forbidden by the Constitution, and several justices seem to agree. Justice Antonin Scalia compared it to old-style Soviet planning. Pat, back to you.
Well, that's the crazy. That was part of the New Deal of President Roosevelt. And the remarkable thing was they had a law that said that people who had too many pigs because they were trying to get the price of pork down, that they had to slaughter their pigs. And the Supreme Court actually upheld those laws that were put in place by Roosevelt during that Reconstruction time back in the Depression, back in the 1930s. And it was shocking to think that they would extend the Commerce Clause to say that a pig grown in Nebraska, for example, was part of interstate commerce, and that a farmer growing that pig could be made to kill his pig because they had too much pork in the market. Well, that's the same law that's carrying out to, and they're forcing these raisin growers to destroy tons and tons, hundreds of tons of their raisin without paying them any money. And that's what brought this lawsuit about. And hopefully, at this point in time, the justices will say, no way, we can't do this to people anymore. But this is just one of many lawsuits that's coming up now as craziness from some bygone era has taken hold of our nation in the year 2015 or 2016. Well, we've been talking, ladies and gentlemen, about the source of fat. We've been talking about nutrition. We've been talking. Well, a new group of scientists in England has reaffirmed, maybe they were watching the 700 Club. John?
Pat, that's right. What makes people fat? Not getting enough exercise? Not necessarily so, says a group of health professionals, including cardiologists and sports experts. They say the real cause of the obesity epidemic is sugar and diabetes. Writing in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, they say poor diet causes more diseases than a lack of physical activity, alcohol, and smoking combined. They point out that people are just as active now as they were a few decades ago, but the obesity rate has skyrocketed. They write this places the blame for our expanding waistlines directly on the type and amount of calories consumed. And they add, let us bust the myth of physical inactivity and obesity. You cannot outrun a bad diet. Pat, probably something you already knew.
I've been talking about it, John, for years right here on this program. I am pleased to report that I went back to the kitchen and exercised my culinary skills and came up with something absolutely delicious and very healthful.
Oh, do tell.
Lentil soup.
Love lentils.
Lentils and onions and celery and olive oil and, you know.
Very Mediterranean.
Worcestershire and a few other things. And then my wife said, well, why don't we put a lamb shank in it? So, okay, we put a lamb shank in it and boiled it and everything.
Wow.
It's absolutely delicious.
Oh my goodness, do you have any left?
You're invited, darling. Pat's lentil soup.
So this was a Pat original, pretty Pat
Yeah,
and Dee Dee did.
Well, Dee Dee added to the Pat
Hey.
soup, but the salt and the pepper and, you know, Worcestershire sauce and a few things, and it's so good. I like to do that, but I just don't want to get into the kitchen. It's kind of a thing, but if you've got a great big carving knife that you can chop vegetables with and a carving board, you can just go to town.
I am a soup. I love this. I'm a soup person.
Well,
I'm not a culinary genius, but I can do a couple soups.
Well, I've made, my other soup was the minestrone, and it was just dynamite. But I had everything in the kitchen sink. It was so healthy it hurt. But I'm listening. I hope the guys in London are listening to us.